You young rebels, and list while I sing. For love of one's country is a terrible thing. It banishes fear with the speed of a flame, and makes us all part of the patriot game. My name is O'Hanlon, I'm just gone 16. My home is in Monaghan, and there I was weaned. I was taught all my life cruel England to blame, and so I'm a part of the patriot game. 'Tis barely 2 years since I wandered away with the local battalion of the bold IRA. I read of our heroes and wanted the same, to play out my part in the patriot game. They told me how Connolly was shot in a chair, his wounds from the battle all bleeding and bare, his fine body twisted, all battered and lame. They soon made him part of the patriot game.
Offensive against Warren Point Harbour. They've warned the owners of cargo ships using the port that the safety of their vessels can no longer be assured. The harbour has come under mortar bomb attack in the past because the provisionals say it's being used by the Army and Marines on intelligence gathering duties. Train services between Portadown and Dundalk have been disrupted because of a bomb scare. The border section of the line has been closed and security forces are searching the area.
The soldier is still seriously ill after being shot inside the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast. He was hit 3 times when a gunman opened fire on him in a corridor leading from the casualty department to the canteen. And a policeman was also injured when gunmen ambushed an RUC Land Rover on the Springfield Road. Several shots hit the vehicle and the constable was treated in hospital.
There you are. Check round for the heads. Go for it.
Belfast, the north of Ireland. A summer day like any other. Since 1970, the days have been filled with a war that has cost the British government several hundreds of millions of pounds and over 600 dead soldiers and police. In the same time, over 2,000 Irish civilians have been killed. All this is normally reported in the news media like the sports scores. 3 Catholics killed, 1 Protestant killed, 2 British soldiers killed. Terrorists, Protestants and Catholics are the words one most often hears. The image is a bit confused, but it's there nonetheless. Some kind of bizarre religious war. And yet, the 2 principal forces involved in the fighting, the British Army and the Irish Republican Army, have nothing at all to do with religion.
Checker.
Indeed afford to have the country led by any other policy other than a paramount ideal of keeping, indeed, Northern Ireland an integral part of the United Kingdom. Otherwise, we perish. As I have previously said, ladies and gentlemen, from this platform, we, the Unionist Party, and indeed the Orange Institution, have nothing to be apologetic for in the treatment of the minority in this country.
The city of Derry, October 5th, 1968. The beginning of the civil rights movement. These are images of one of the first civil rights marches in Northern Ireland. Civil rights, the name and the tactics immediately evokes the southern United States in the 1950s and 60s. In more ways than one, as is plain to see. A non-violent form of protest for moderate reforms, which is met by systematic police violence. Only at this time and in this place, the protesters were white. They were Irish. For most people who know little about Ireland and even less about Northern Ireland, the events of the late 60s are completely baffling. And with good reason, for Northern Ireland is indeed a peculiar state. For over 50 years, one political party, the Unionists, were in power. They had the support of loyalists of all social classes, thanks to a political line that was very simple. Maintain union with England and preserve loyalist supremacy, no matter what the cost. This meant control of all levels of government, the police, the courts, housing, as well as the major sources of employment. In 1968, unemployment in the nationalist community was nearly 25% compared to 6% for the loyalists. And then there was the Special Powers Act. Over the years, this law has been used to imprison thousands of nationalists without charges or trials. But to understand all this, one must go back in time to the roots of the Troubles. In 1601, English troops led by Lord Mountjoy defeated the last of the Irish chieftains. Ireland, one of the richest agricultural countries in Europe, was in the process of becoming a British colony. In the north of Ireland, where resistance to the conquest had been the strongest, large numbers of Scottish settlers were given land that had been forcibly taken from the natives. The colonizers happened to be Protestant, the displaced Irish happened to be Catholic. That 17th century settlement explains why today in all of Ireland there are 1 million loyalists, loyal to England that is, to 3.5 million Irish nationalists.
But I have also said
300 years later, the Loyalists produced one of their most charismatic and extreme leaders, the Reverend Ian Paisley. In the late 60s, Paisley led a popular Loyalist reaction against the civil rights movement, making it impossible for the Unionist government to offer the Nationalists even the slightest reforms.
whether in prison or out of prison, I'm going to fight O'Neill and Van.
In the face of Paisley's attacks, the civil rights movement tried desperately to overcome traditional sectarian divisions between loyalists and nationalists.
Here in Uri, 2,500 people are unemployed.
The theory was to ignore the national question, the division of Ireland, and instead just call for social reforms that could have benefited many loyalist workers as well. The movement's most eloquent leader was a young student, Bernadette Devlin.
Because if he stands up on his own 2 feet and he says, look, I do 40 hours a week and you make a great deal of profit out of my labour and I'm entitled to a better wage. It's a very simple, very liberal demand. I am entitled to more money for the work I do. Yet that person, if he makes such a demand, can be fired immediately because there are 2,500 people wanting that one job.
The civil rights movement was not the first effort to unite the two communities in Ireland. In the 1790s, the United Irishman movement, led by Protestant revolutionaries such as Henry Joy McCracken, organised a major rebellion. The movement, which objected to trade restrictions imposed by England, was strongly influenced by the American and French revolutions and aimed to establish an independent Irish republic. Although the leaders of the rising were mainly Protestant and tried to recruit settlers into the movement, the settler community as a whole stayed loyal to the colonial government. And loyal it has remained throughout every single rebellion in Irish history. In the 1798 rebellion, 30,000 nationalists were killed and over 10,000 loyalists died fighting for the English.
To a penny that Ennis, like any other town, has its slum landlord. I would lay a pound to a penny that Ennis, like any other town, has got a great patch of land that is used solely for Yankees to play on. I would lay a pound to a penny that there are quite a lot of families in Ennis paying rents they can't afford for property they shouldn't be asked to live in. That there are people in this town working for wages they can't keep their family on, for men who don't need half the money they're wringing out of the work of Irish people. Therefore, the greatest help that you can give the people in the north is by showing the people in the north that they're not mad. They're not mad for believing. They're not mad for being idealists. They're not mad for thinking that someday, somehow, we are going to achieve the Workers' Republic.
Where, oh, where is our James Connolly? Oh, where is that gallant man? He's gone to organise the Union. Than to working men, they might yet be free. Then who will lead the van?
In the early years of the 20th century, Jim Larkin and James Connolly organised the Irish working class and linked it for the first time to the long-standing Republican movement. This was a revolutionary development, and it led to the most important of all rebellions, the Easter Rising. On April 24th, 1916, Connolly led the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, in an insurrection in Dublin. But the rebels, besides being poorly organized, had little popular support, and within a week the rebellion had been crushed. And then the British government blundered. 16 rebel leaders, including Connolly, were executed, and thousands of nationalists were interned in prison camps in England. Almost overnight, the Irish people began to give their active support to the IRA.
Was better to die 'neath an Irish sky than at Suvla or Soudel Bar. When from the plains of Royal Meath strong men came hurrying through, while the English Huns with their long-range guns poured hell through the foggy dew. 'Twas England bade our wild geese go, that small nations might be free. But their lonely graves are by Sulva's waves, o'er the fringe of the great North Sea. Oh, had they died by Pierce's side, or had fought with the noble Cattlebrew, their names we'd keep where the Fenians sleep, 'neath the shroud or the foggy dew.
By 1920, the IRA had developed a highly successful campaign that was to become a model of modern guerrilla warfare. Despite mass arrests, Britain was unable to defeat the nationalists militarily, and the British government was forced to concede a certain measure of independence for the Irish. At the same time, they readily accepted the demands of the Loyalists in the north, not to be included in an independent Ireland. Thus, a 26-county Free State was formed in the south, while 6 counties in the north remained under British jurisdiction. The new statelet of Northern Ireland was assured a majority of 1 million Loyalists to 500,000 nationalists. The selected 6 counties also happened to contain most of Ireland's industry. But it was only after a bitter civil war among Republicans before conservative nationalists, backed by the British, were finally able to impose the settlement. It was in this way that British economic interests were protected, the IRA neutralized, and Ireland was divided. And for the next 50 years, the Unionists in the north governed through discrimination and police terror. But the Loyalists were living in fear, haunted by the spectre of the IRA. The Patriot game was far from over. Derry City, the end of the civil rights movement. Beginning on August 12, 1969, the paramilitary Loyalist police force attacked the nationalist ghettos in Derry and Belfast. It was reaction in its purest form. A violent effort to return to a time before the civil rights movement had existed, when nationalists had been passive and demoralized. In Derry, barricades and Molotov cocktails stopped the police. But in Belfast, the ghettos are smaller and more isolated, and there the police were not stopped. 500 homes in nationalist districts were burnt down, 9 people killed, and over 1,800 families fled south.
In the Belfast area has been in the Catholic area, the Catholic community which has suffered most physical damage.
Well, this may well be. I'm not in a position to say yet, because quite frankly it hasn't been feasible for many people to go into those areas, as you know, and it will obviously take a very long time to make a count and assessment of all the dreadful things that have happened.
Of red brick houses soulless, charred and burned, stand face to face and back to back. There's no lace curtains now. An echo from the distant past, impervious to pain, cement and bricks and human skill will raise them up again. From my flat above the streets I stare, I curse my newfound home. No human skill will raise my love to bloom into a man. Shot by cowards in his bed at the tender age of 9, cry murder, my child Patrick's dead in Belfast 69.
I understand today that they're bringing down their barricades in order that the authority might clean their streets for them. Having littered and turned the bog side into a filthy place, then they expect the municipal authority or the commission authority to do the cleaning up for them. Now I want to say something this afternoon and underline it, that as far as I am concerned, the Protestant people have had enough of this condoning of popery and this sellout to Rome.
On August 15th, 1969, British troops began arriving in Northern Ireland with the announced aim of keeping the peace between the two communities. But in reality, they were there to prop up a state faced with a virtual insurrection. The civil rights movement had suddenly become irrelevant. After August, it was too late for reforms.
Following the failure of the 52-62 campaign, which failed fundamentally because it didn't have the mass support within the nationalist ghetto areas of the occupied North, there was a reanalysis, and because of a certain amount of demoralisation which resulted from that failure, there was a reformist element which gained control of the movement. As a result, in 1969, when the nationalist ghetto areas of the occupied North were attacked by loyalist extremists, the Republican Army was not in a position to defend the nationalist people, and initially there was a sectarian response to those attacks, and the armed ability of the nationalist people was built up. However, those people who had initially formed the political core of the Republican Army, reanalyzing that situation, that is the 1969 crisis, realized that the sectarian element was merely a symptom of British imperialist rule, and consequently it was a necessity to reanalyze a response to that symptom. This led to the emergence of what became known as the Provisional IRA, and the Provisional IRA was to be distinguished because it advocated the necessity of an armed struggle to be directed at the main core of the problem, which was British imperialism, and not a reformist approach to sectarianism, which was merely a symptom of British imperialist rule. For us, this war is not just a war of shooting British soldiers. It is also about coming to a final political objective, which is the creation of a 32-county democratic socialist republic to be controlled by the ordinary people for their own benefit.
Stand still, you're under arrest for breaking security.
As I speak to you, the security forces are very fully engaged in the task of dealing effectively with the lawbreakers in our community. The Army is holding an area of the lower falls under strict control of movement for the rest of this weekend, subject only to such relaxations as are necessary to prevent actual hardship and to allow people tomorrow to fulfill their religious obligations. Details of these controls and of the areas to which they apply have already been announced. We all regret, of course, the inconvenience caused to decent, law-abiding people in this area who constitute the great majority. But we are determined to rid them and Northern Ireland as a whole of the terrorists in their midst.
In the middle of 1970, when following a sectarian attack on one of the nationalist ghetto areas in Belfast, the Short Strand area, the provisionals were in a position to successfully defend that particular ghetto, where the nationalist people were outnumbered something like 10 to 1. The following week, which was July 1970, in a direct response to the ability of the Republican Army to defend the nationalist ghetto areas, the British Army occupied one major nationalist ghetto area, the Lower Falls. But from the provisionals' point of view, this was further vindication of why armed struggle was necessary, because this was the first physical manifestation of British imperialism since the 1920s. And for the first time, the people could relate to the provisionals' claims that sectarianism was in fact just a symptom and that the main enemy was British imperialism itself. And here was something with which they could identify.
I was down at the corner of Marston Street about 20 past 12 on Friday night or Sunday morning. Couldn't get home to my own home. It was only around the corner at Murdoch Street. Seen a man getting shot down, shot through the head by the Scots troops at the corner of Colonization Road. And the ambulance was about 20 minutes coming, and I had trouble getting out with the man. I think the man has since died.
Going to chapel this morning, we were searched 4 week hours, and they weren't even going to let us out to go to chapel this morning.
It was like hell opening for sinners. It was shocking. It was worse than the Battle of Mons. They're going into the houses and wrecking the houses and all. And if you seen that man's house, you could cry your eyes out looking at it.
Friday night at 6:15, my wife took bad. She was badly hit with tear gas. She was taken to Royal Victoria Hospital very ill, along with, she was expecting a baby. Baby was born at 3:15 the next morning. Baby's still very ill, along with the wife. I was taken at gunpoint from my house. Yes, I was taken at gunpoint over to Royal Victoria Hospital, taken into Royal Victoria Hospital to see my wife, and they were standing there with the guns on me at the corner. At the very bed where my wife was lying, and they had their guns on me. They marched me like a trooper down the street again. They got me to the bottom of the street and stood me up against the wall and searched me, made me lie on my face. Then they took me around to the house. When I come round to the house again, they wrecked my home. I had just come round to the house again, they were just away. They wrecked my home. Dogs that I had for our people, they set them free. Baby's clothes, the meter, beds, they tore them apart. The food, they spread it all over the place, searching for it. They went upstairs, bunk beds, took them down. They took the wife's bed down, wardrobes, took all that down. They broke the windows in the back. They're animals, nothing but short, just animals. The Scotch men were walking down the street and they're walking by, got the wee van outside the door, couldn't do enough depredation. They broke every window in the van. They said this will stop bullets. Then they kept boasting, we'll fix the ARA, we fix the ARA. 4,500 of them, armed with tanks, machine guns, the lot, Saracen cars. They fixed the ARA. 20 or 30 brave men with guns who they tried to murder, which they have murdered, and which they'll continue to murder. That's the British Army. Professionals, professional looters, professional robbers, professional thieves.
It was with the occupation of the Falls Road that the nationalist population began to see the British Army clearly as the enemy, not as a neutral police force. It was also the beginning of what has since become the longest war in the history of English-Irish conflict.
Get that guy now! Shortly after the Falls Road occupation, guerrilla war started, but it was a new kind of war. The IRA did not just ambush British soldiers, they also launched a bombing campaign against British economic interests. These actions have on occasion led to terrible tragedies, as with the Le Mans restaurant bombing of February 1978, in which 14 people were killed. Nonetheless, civilian casualties as a result of the Provisionals' guerrilla war have been relatively low, for their bombings are in fact systematically preceded by warnings. By August 1971, the number of monthly bombings had risen to over 90. The British government, which directly reimburses businesses for all war damage that they suffer, was beginning to pay a very high price for its Northern Irish colony. This single bombing of a Belfast hotel caused no deaths or injuries, but it did cause more than £2 million damage. Against this guerrilla campaign, the British government hit back with a measure that had always worked well in the past, the Special Powers Act.
They burst in the door about 20 minutes to 5. They didn't wait till we would get up and answer the door. They were in the bedroom before we were dressed. They told my husband, "You're getting arrested under the Special Powers Act."
It is with understandable reluctance that one uses these exceptional powers. This is not action taken against any responsible and law-abiding section of the community, nor is it in any way punitive or indiscriminate. Its benefits should be felt, not least in those places where violent men have exercised a certain sway by threat and intimidation over decent and responsible men and women. The main target of the present operation is the Irish Republican Army, which has been responsible for recent acts of terrorism.
On August 9, 1971, 330 nationalists were arrested in dawn raids. In the rioting that day, 14 people were killed.
The introduction of internment has given the ordinary soldier like myself a chance to get to grips with the gunmen, because our main problem isn't the local population, it's just the IRA gunmen that we are interested in.
Through the little streets of Belfast in the dark of early morn, British soldiers came a-running, wrecking little homes in scorn. Heedless of the crying children, dragging fathers from their beds, beaten sons while helpless mothers watched the blood flow from their heads. Armored cars and tanks and guns came to take away our sons. Every man will stand behind the man behind the wire. Not for them a judge or jury, nor indeed a crime at all. Being Irish means they're guilty, so we're guilty one and all. All around the truth will echo, Cromwell's men are here again. England's name again is sullied in the eyes of honest men.
Well, there was no means to heat up the body. Now these people have been sitting from 4:30 on Monday morning till now, and they're still in the same conditions. They've been put into huts, as I say, like pigs. And the only time they get out is for interrogation by the bastards of the RUC special branch. Now, as everybody well knows, when you go in for interrogation...
Just days after internment was introduced, the nationalists began to realise that the internees had not only been beaten up, which everyone expected, but that some had been severely tortured. Electric shocks, druggings, deprivation of sleep, food, water, all came under the official term of deep interrogation. In 1976, the European Commission of Human Rights found the British government guilty of torturing certain internees. Britain promised that such interrogation methods would never again be used. But in 1978, two different studies, one by Amnesty International and another by an independent tribunal of jurists, concluded that brutality and torture against nationalist suspects remained a widespread practice.
To me, during these torture periods, was I was in the Springfield Road Torture Centre, and I'd been held for about 3 days at the time, and had undergone the usual torture treatment, that is the beating, the threats, the hot and cold treatment, you know, hot water and so on and so forth. And I was brought into a room where a special branch was there, you know, that's the torturers. And he pulled a truncheon from the drawer, and he told me that the method of interrogation could be two ways, the easy way or the hard way. But I was very frightened, you know, so I told him I wanted the easy way. And he told me, gave me a slip of paper and a pen, and told me that I was to give him the names of two prominent IRA men, you know, two IRA volunteers, officers. And I said I didn't know any. So he left the room to get the heavy squad. These are the guerrillas, you know, that give you the big beating. And that if I hadn't got the names by the time he returned, I could expect the full treatment. So he went away, you know, and I was pissed off at this, you know, and came back. And do you know any names? And I said, well, I don't know anybody, but, and when I said but, he jumped, you know, he said, right, Mr. Austin, we know you're a very sound kind of a guy, and you tell us names and we let you go. You can go home to your family. So I says, well, the names I know are Daithí O'Connell and Joe Cahill, you know, whose names were on TV every night. And this he went fucking mad, you know, and dragged me from the room back into the cell. But these are one of the many stories that have happened, you know. This is the humorous side of interrogation. You know, the other side is that 2 streets from here, last week, a boy of 19 was arrested and was beaten to death by the special branch and by the British soldiers. This is a general practice. Either beat you to death or near to death, you know, and this is what it's all about.
I am an officer with the Northern Ireland Prison Service. Let me tell you about my job. There's lots of variety, like driving, using modern equipment, escorting prisoners to court, but mostly dealing with people. I work with great mates, and I'm earning over £80 a week, and that's without overtime. The prison service needs people. People like you. Get the facts. Send the coupon from your newspaper now.
Since 1971, virtually every adult in the nationalist ghettos had been arrested and interrogated at least once. In 1978, there were over 3,000 men and women in prisons and prison camps in Ireland and Britain, the largest one being Long Kesh, just outside of Belfast. Through the years, nationalist prisoners have struggled repeatedly using hunger strikes, prison insurrections and escapes in order to assert their rights as prisoners of war. Rights which were recognised by the British government before March 1976, but which have since been denied to all nationalists arrested after that date.
So when internment was introduced in 1971, there was a spontaneous reaction by the nationalist people to this particular repressive measure, which allowed the Republican Army to re-accelerate its war, and the main emphasis within that war was an economic bombing strategy. And the whole emphasis of the armed struggle was a destabilization program to prevent politics, as it had manifested itself within the occupied North, from stabilizing itself and consolidating some sort of base for itself. And that because most of the political parties were already backed by commercial interests, the best way of obtaining that destabilization was with an economic bombing strategy.
It's very difficult to suggest any particular security action that can avoid this kind of thing. This particular devastation apparently was caused by a lorry hijacked in Joy Street yesterday. Now there must be some people who saw the hijackers. There must be some people who know who's involved in this bombing. I doubt very much whether there are very many people organizing this. I doubt whether there are very many people taking part in it. But it is high time that every citizen of Northern Ireland, quite irrespective of religion, quite irrespective of politics, came forward and said, I have information. And that, in my view, is the only adequate means of dealing with this sort of situation.
How about the SDLP? How do you feel about them?
Pegs, but don't feel anything about them. They'll let us down.
Is there anybody in this part of Belfast that you place your confidence in?
Yes, the provies.
As the war accelerated after internment, the nationalists not only rejected government authority, but also the moderate nationalist parties who still hoped to reform the state. Bypassing the politicians, they began to deal directly with the problems faced by the community. This meant building parks and daycare centres for children, as well as meeting places for the elderly in areas which had never had the slightest social services.
Neighbourhood people's assemblies were formed to solve housing, unemployment and other day-to-day problems. All this activity culminated with the formation of entire self-governing areas that became known as Free Derry and Free Belfast. The large nationalist community in Derry refused to pay rents and taxes to the Unionist government, and the police and army were kept out of the area by barricades openly manned by the IRA. In effect, Derry had seceded from Northern Ireland. On October 11th, 1969, there were riots in the Loyalist districts of Belfast. So the city government took the public buses off the road. 3 days later, they were rolling again in Loyalist areas. But it was 3 months before bus service was restored to the nationalist ghettos. Forced back upon their own resources, some enterprising local people went over to England and began bringing back second-hand taxis. This was the beginning of the Falls Taxi Association, the People's Taxis.
Mary!
Well, only for the taxis, I don't think any of us would have went to work because there's no buses on the road. Turf Lodge buses off the road, the White Rock Road buses off the road, and it's about 2 miles to walk down to the White Rock Road. So you'd be late for work, so we wouldn't be in. Tell you this, right?
Got their taxis too, and when the troubles slow,
yeah,
they got them too, because
yeah, that's right.
There's any trouble on it, even on the falls, so like, you'll always get a taxi up too.
That's all.
That's all we got to talk about.
The taxi men are very obliging.
We could point out that the Falls Taxi Association is now among the biggest self-help organisation in the north of Ireland. We now have 350 drivers, 450 persons, self-employed, actually working on the routes that we have specified before. The media treat us very unkindly with the fact that in Newry, for instance, the second highest unemployed town in the north of Ireland, where the Minister of Commerce got 7 minutes on the national news and in the national press to the effect that he had created 15 jobs. And he stated that it cost £17,000 to create a job for one person in Northern Ireland. Yet we have never received any credibility or acknowledgement from any source to the effect that we have created 350 jobs, permanent jobs for people that, because of the areas where they live, the nationalist ghettos, they can't find employment anywhere else. They have to remain in the areas.
This is the lower part of the falls now. We're coming down into the area of the White Rock. And this is the general route when you're coming down into the centre of the town, so it is, you know. And as I say, we come down to this bottom of this road, like, it's quite a heavy bit of traffic on it, you know. But at one time we used to have to go through these areas when there was riot and burnings and hijacking of buses and whatnot, you know. And the whole thing about it was, not during one of those times did any of our taxis ever stop or fail to run a service, you know, in these areas. And this is why the public has showed consent to use the taxis, because their point of view was that we have got them to work, we're dependable, we're a far more efficient service and quicker, and we're cheap. And this is why they depend on us, so they do at the moment. You're now approaching the junction of the White Rock, which at one time was a tremendous for riding and hijacked buses at that time during confrontations with the security forces. One example, during internment day, there was quite a few people shot up around this area, and still, even then, the taxi still ran, you know. This is the Lower Falls end of it, where most of the riding and burning had taken place. And as I say, during those times, while the taxis was travelling through it, the riders were courteous enough to stop throwing for that few seconds and to let us through, so that they got the safety of their own people back home, you know. Went up to a place now called Divis Flats, and this is where a lot of the RUC had turned their guns on innocent people at that time, so they did, you know. But as I say, the taxis didn't bother. They just kept on running in and out the side streets. They took variation routes as long as they got the people home. They went over barricades and everything, so they did, you know. And this was the whole point. The taxis never did stop running, and I think this was a thorn in the side of the security forces.
Harassment of the taxis, it's a general thing. If you look behind us now, this is a normal procedure where they throw up roadblocks, stop motorists, especially taxis, and take the driving licence off the driver and make them sit for anything up to 30 minutes, search the vehicle, make the passenger stand on the side of the road. Sometimes they attempt to arrest the drivers for unknown reasons. Most of the drivers are well known on the road. They're on it 7 days a week. We have to react when they do arrest a driver, and our alternative and the only weapon that we have is to set up our own roadblocks. What we would do would seal off the vehicle that would be trying to arrest the driver, put taxis at the front, to the side and the back of it, and hem him in. Generally that works, and they release the driver. If they do arrest a driver and take him away, what we normally do then would be block off the main arteries into the city. When we do this, we can close the entire city within a matter of minutes. You only need to close off 3 roads, and that brings the complete standstill to the entire city centre. Generally, this serves the purpose, and the driver is released after a short period.
In 1971, nationalist civilians became increasingly the random targets of a campaign of no-warning bombs, kidnappings and assassinations. In other words, death squads. It was a loyalist reaction. But the British Army paid scant attention to the loyalist paramilitaries. Their major concern was in dealing with the new wave of mass demonstrations by nationalists protesting against internment. The streets of Northern Ireland soon became a real-life laboratory for the Army's experiments in controlling an insurgent population. And the nationalists were the human guinea pigs. One of the techniques was the use of so-called harmless weapons, including the not-so-harmless CS gas, which was first widely used in Vietnam. CS gas is in fact lethal and can cause permanent damage to the lungs, stomach and eyes. But the gas, the water cannons, the banning of marches, the mass arrests, all had little apparent effect. Week after week, large demonstrations were held against internment. Finally, in Derry, on January 30th, 1972, the British Army decided to use a more effective technique: live arms.
Got out before they even stopped the Saracen tank, got on his knee and shot everywhere. And about seconds after, soldiers followed him and done the same thing. And we heard them from that flat there calling, "Don't stop shooting, shoot the Irish bastards."
And I say again that I hesitate to call anyone liars, but the facts are we were fired at first, and we retaliated in the only way which was possible to us.
No weapon, he hadn't a stone, he had nothing. He was just standing. And as we turned, they started firing. Well, we heard the shots. We heard a few shots, and as we turned, he fell dead.
He went to tell the soldiers to stop firing. You can see the blood running there where the gentleman was shot at. But that's all I can tell. I was too shocked.
I never saw it even, and the worst film I ever looked at. It was massacre. It was mass murder. And I don't care who hears me say it. And I don't care, I never hope to love to see the day that'll never happen again. For it's pure murder. Murder.
They come in shooting, there was no doubt about it. From the commander box side, they were shooting even before the commander box side. And there wasn't a nail bomb thrown in this area. No, there wasn't a rifle shot fired. They were the people who done the shooting. And then the police backed them up from the walls here. Police, they shot down from the walls. That's what caused that fellow's death there. He tried to help two other lads, and they were shot down just like a bloody dog, just like animals we were shot at. And I have no doubt, that this has been planned. They called off the Orange meeting and the Paisley Night meeting and the Guildhall so that they could shoot us. They didn't care who we were, didn't care man, woman or child here. A youngster died this morning with a run over with a Saracen and then went back over the top there again. I mean, what are we going to do? Are we going to stand by idly and watch it all?
Following Bloody Sunday, there was a tremendous upsurge of nationalist feeling throughout Ireland. Large demonstrations were held north and south, and in Dublin, a 30,000-strong crowd burnt down the British Embassy. For the first time, the nationalist resistance had assumed threatening proportions in the south, where Britain still had important economic interests. The British government had little choice but to make major concessions. On March 24th, 1972, the Unionist government was suspended by London, and Britain promised to release the internees. That Easter, as the nationalists in Derry held their annual commemoration of the 1916 Rising, their resistance movement was apparently in its strongest position since the start of the war.
Of their destiny. On one hand, if we are determined, if we are courageous, if we are resolute, and if we are strong-willed enough to recognize that compromise will not solve our country's problems, if we recognize that compromise never achieved anything, and that compromise never will achieve anything, and that therefore our fight must continue and that we will win that fight, then we are truly following in the footsteps of the men and the women and the boys and girls of Easter week.
Suspending operations at Christmas and at Easter, and in implementing a 3-day unilateral truce on March 10th, 11th and 12th last. In addition, we have held wide-ranging talks with various groups and parties with a view to holding an all-Irish conference. Would you put your question again, please?
Isn't it politically very difficult, if not impossible, for Mr. Whitelaw to do as you suggest, in view of the high emotion that's been engendered amongst Protestants, particularly with the forthcoming weekend?
Well, my reply to that would be this, that if Mr. Whitelaw and his government are sincerely interested in peace, then they'll be prepared to discuss our terms with us.
We were anxious to discuss our proposals with the representatives of the British government, but we were determined that if there was going to be a truce, it was going to be a bilateral truce. It was going to be one that would be publicly recognised by the British, and that would be conditions that would be binding on the British Army as well as on the Republican Army, and this was done. Then we went to London and we met Mr. Whitelaw and members of his political staff, and we listened to what he had to say, which didn't amount to very much, and then we presented our own document, our own proposals, and which we called upon the British government to recognise the right of the Irish people as a whole, acting as a single unit to decide the future of Ireland, and we called upon the British government to withdraw all their forces by a specified date. Mr. Whitelaw didn't turn down our proposals. He said he would refer them back to his cabinet, and this is what I believe brought about the ending of the truce. That Mr. Whitelaw went back to Ted Heath, who was Prime Minister at the time, showed him our document, our proposals. Ted Heath read them and turned around and said, well, I don't think there's anything can be done here. You'd better break the truce as soon as you can. And in fact, the truce broke on the following Sunday night. And it nearly broke that morning in Portadown, where there was severe provocation. And it broke on that Sunday night. It was inevitable in view of the behaviour of the British troops in Lenadoon, in Belfast, that the truce was going to break. It broke with tragic results for everybody concerned, but for tragic results for the Irish people, for the English people, tragic results for the British troops and the IRA volunteers and the civilians who've been killed since then. And I hope that the day will come again when British representatives realise that the only way to a permanent peace in Ireland is to meet the representatives of the Republican movement and negotiate with them a phased and orderly withdrawal.
2 days after the peace talks in London, the truce broke down in the Lenadoon housing estate of Belfast. There, 16 displaced nationalist families had been allocated homes by the Public Housing Authority. But the homes bordered a loyalist district, and the Ulster Defence Association, the largest of several loyalist paramilitary groups, opposed the move. In turn, the British Army refused to permit the families to enter the houses. In the confrontation that day in Lenadoon, 6 civilians were shot dead. In the next week, 13 British soldiers were killed. It was the end of a truce which had lasted barely 2 weeks. Following the breakdown of the truce, the Provisionals launched their biggest military offensive to date. The commercial centres of Derry, Belfast and other major towns began to look as if they had been blitzed from the air. In the space of a few days, British investment was hit with millions of pounds of losses. And because of warnings, there were virtually no civilian casualties, until July 21st, when bombs placed in Belfast killed 9 civilians. The British government and media seized the opportunity given by Bloody Friday, as it was to be called, to present the IRA as mad terrorists. It was only several months later that an investigation by the London Sunday Times revealed that hour-long warnings for all the bombs had been given to the Samaritan organization, which had in turn notified the police. For some reason, however, several of the bomb alerts were not passed on by the police to the target areas. The result was several innocent people killed and injured, and a tremendous propaganda victory for the British government.
A lot of people assumed that this distortion was bad journalism, when in fact that was not accurate. For this distortion was a deliberate tactic within the context of Frank Kitson's theory of counterinsurgency, because Kitson has recognized the important role that the media has to play in a counterinsurgency campaign, and has always strived to use the media as a platform where necessary to distort the image of the Republican Army as a liberation movement, and to project this image of the British occupation forces as some kind of police service.
Ten days after Bloody Friday, 22,000 British troops occupied the nationalist ghettos in a move codenamed Operation Motorman. It was the end of Free Derry and Free Belfast.
Let Arab see, there's the power. There's the power there. What chance have I against a man like that?
The cream of the British Army, the paratroopers. A couple of thousand came over them house last night and cut us their ribbons. They didn't give us a chance. Over for them. Arrange a meeting with Jack Lynch and
it's a blarney.
That's a lot of bloody hooey.
Yankee blarney.
We're down up here. We're getting murdered up here. Murdered.
I have made it perfectly clear that these operations are designed to protect the whole community, to remove the fear of intimidation by terrorists from the community, from wherever it may come. And I think that after the work of Her Majesty's government over these recent months, the patience of Her Majesty's government, the work to convince the minority community that we are determined to give them a fair deal, I trust this friction will not arise. I see no reason why it should. The security forces are there to protect the whole community.
There are over 1,000 different British firms throughout Ireland, north and south, controlling more than 60% of the country's total industrial activity. One week after Operation Motorman, moderate nationalist politicians were having talks with William Whitelaw. In order to pacify the nationalists, the British government was willing to force concessions from the Unionists. Finally, in January 1974, a power-sharing government was formed, in which moderate nationalists were given certain cabinet positions. It was a Northern Ireland first, also a last. The problem was that after 300 years of ascendancy, the loyalist people would only support a government that could guarantee their privileges. Power sharing with the nationalists was unthinkable. On May 14, 1974, loyalist extremist groups controlling workers in the key electric generating plants launched a strike against the new government. When the British Army refused to intervene, the success of the strike was assured. Within 2 weeks, the power-sharing government fell. Britain had been caught in the contradiction of trying to reform a state that was simply irreformable. It could only be consolidated by the physical crushing of the nationalist resistance. The other solution, the only possible one for the nationalists, remained the destruction of the Northern Ireland state itself. The struggle in the north had passed the point of no return.
Decided to protest against internment, and despite the ban on parades, we have decided that we will parade tomorrow through the streets of Derry.
This is Turf Lodge, a housing estate in West Belfast. It's a nationalist district like most others, which means an unemployment rate of over 20%. It also means a military occupation, endless raids and arrests, and the constant threat of violent death. On October 4th, 1976, 12-year-old Brian Stewart of Turf Lodge was playing in front of his home when he was killed by a plastic bullet fired by a British foot patrol. At the time, there was no rioting or gun battles in the area, which made the killing all the more senseless. Since then, the women of Turf Lodge have gone out into the streets each and every day to protest against the continued British Army presence.
Turf Lodge sort of started it, and all the women came out with their biddleds and whistles, and now, 3 or 4 months later, all the nationalist areas, St James's, White Rock, Ballymurphy, Ardoyne, the Strand, they're nearly all out with their biddleds and whistles again. The women are starting to show the lead. You know, they recognise the need for them to work on the par with the men. I mean, from the start, women have been involved in the military campaign, but now the women who sort of usually stayed at home are all coming out and beginning to feel the power that they have when they're all banded together and coming out as a force and making their presence felt in the area. The Brits obviously don't like this at all, and if there's only 1 or 2 women out, they think they can sort of abuse them, but before they know it, there's hundreds out, and the Brits are chased out of this particular area. Last week at the elections, you remember they had the elections and we had a picket outside. We were telling the people, why are you going to vote? You're going to vote for British imperialism. You've had it 800 years, and what has it achieved?
In August 1976, in the midst of the continuing war, a peace movement was formed which tried to regroup moderate nationalist and loyalist women. And for the first time in a long time, Northern Ireland became front-page news throughout the world. The peace movement was significant as a truly remarkable media event, which, however, never quite took root in reality.
They came into formation after 3 children had been killed in an accident on the Upper Falls Road. And what had happened was that an IRA active service unit were going out to ambush the British Army, and on the way to the ambush they were chased by a British patrol. The patrol opened fire on the car. The driver was killed. The car obviously went out of control and hit the 3 children. At the beginning of that, there was obvious sympathy towards the family, and people were very sympathetic, and people were very sorry what had happened. The peace movement, led by Kieran McKeown, a local pro-British journalist, used this opportunity to launch a movement that was directed against the IRA. From its very formation, what it condemned were selective. It condemned IRA violence, but didn't condemn British Army violence. It condemned the shooting of businessmen, but allowed the shooting of innocent Catholic civilians. It progressed solely because it was well financed, and we believe that it is financed solely by the British government and by pro-British elements and by big business. It continued to about January of this year, fairly strong, you know. What happened then was, in the West Belfast area, the British Army deliberately sent in the paratroop regiment, who, as you can remember, were responsible for the massacres in Derry, the shooting of Magella O'Hare, the schoolgirl who was murdered by the British Army, and other mysterious shootings in the country areas. The British Army were directly responsible for those. The parachute regiment came in typical SS fashion, house raiding, abuse, beating people up, in-depth interrogation, and in actual fact they threw a young boy out of the window at the interrogation centre that I mentioned earlier on, Springfield Road Barracks. This effectively alienated the people even more from the British Army, and the Republican movement were seen to be the only ones who cared and who could provide the alternative to this type of attitude that the British Army had adopted. All through this campaign of harassment by the British paratroop regiment, the peace movement issued no statements, didn't condemn the violence. in fact issued statements saying that they support law and order and that we, the nationalist people, should do the same. The problem was that how can you support law and order when law and order is kicking your door in and beating you up?
See him? He's well. Family and a post. Standing in front of Helt højt lige der nede, der er kæsten.
Did you brush your teeth in it? Wash your face also,
When I was young, I used to be as fine a man as ever you'd see in the Prince of Wales. He said to me, come and join the British Army. They're looking for monkeys up at the zoo. It says, one, if I had a face like you, I joined the British Army. Sarah Connon baked a cake and so for poor old Slattery sake, sure I threw myself into the lake pretending I was Barmy. I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army. Sergeant Healy went away and his wife got in the family way, and the only word that she could say was blame the British Army. Me curse upon the Labour blue that took me darling boy from me to join the British Army. Corporal Sheen is a terrible note, just give him a couple of jars of stout and he bait the enemy with his mouth and save the British Army. I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me to get home to you and the British Army.
My friend Bell, he is in the yard, you see. Oh, what. He's in my sarsen, and he snuggled and close to me. Oh, he says he's been so very, very poor, because them crickets, they don't want them anymore. Oh, I've got a brand new shiny outfit and a pair of kinky boots. I've got a fully black jack and a lovely khaki suit. And when we go on that patrol, we'll have each other's hand. Oh, we are the British Army, and we're here to keep your land. Oh, my friend Tom, he is in the yard. He travels everywhere, travels near and far. He won't go near the Falls Road, no bloody fear. The only thing to get there is a bullet in your ear. Oh, I've got a brand new shiny helmet and a pair of kinky boots.
Prod. Sugar. Prod. Anna! Right, as from now this camp officially starts. When you're on this camp, you'll not leave the room and you'll not smoke without permission. When you're on the camp, you'll use numbers instead of your name. You'll be numbered from 1 to 3. The stag, there's a girl, have to stay on the camp 24 hours a day. I'm the TO. I'll be teaching you the weapons, and you'll not handle a weapon until I tell you or you ask permission. Prod, leave him off. Right. This is the AR-15. The first thing you do when you take possession of any weapon, you check it for safe. If there's a magazine on it, you release it. You check the breech by touch and by sight when possible. Check the safe. Put the weapon off cock. Always point the weapon in a safe direction. Never take anyone's word that the weapon is safe. Right now, I'll name the parts. Down the top, down the right, down the left, and down the bottom.
And the Republican movement quite clearly have outlined their proposals for the future Ireland. That's called Ar Nua, the New Ireland. And in the New Ireland we envisage communities, self-governed communities, that is the people on the ground will have a say in their lives, will have a say in how their area is run, and will have a dignity that the workers have lacked for so long in Ireland. Those community councils will be affiliated to a regional council, who in turn will be under the direction of what's known as the provincial councils, And Ireland is divided in four. You have four provinces. You have Ulster, Munster, Leinster and Connaught. And these councils at every step will take into consideration the wishes of the people from the ground to the provincial governments, who in turn will be affiliated to the federal parliament of Ireland. And this is the solution to the problem of Ireland today. The solution is not to get rid of the Brits and exchange one master for another master, the Irish capitalist. The solution is to give the control and the wealth of Ireland to the people of Ireland and allow them to administrate what they need for themselves. And the point that I made earlier on about the peace people, or so-called peace people, they are actively working against us. They have said that what we need is more bureaucracy, and we need to have more civil servants ruling our lives. And we quite simply said the solution to Ireland is the people, the Irish people, who can provide the solution, and that solution will be found only under a socialist system. You know, and that's it.
This Ireland of mine has for long been half free. 6 counties are under John Bull's tyranny, and still De Valera is greatly to blame for shirking his part in the Patriot Game. I don't mind a bit if I shoot down police. They're lackeys for war, never guardians of peace. But yet as deserters I'm never letting those rebels who sold out the Patriot Game. And now as I lie with my body all hoes, I think of those traitors who bargained and sold. I'm sorry my rifle has not done the same for the quislings who sold out the Patriot Game.